There was a time when I believed distance was the most reliable form of truth. Not because it revealed people for who they were, but because it revealed who they remained when nothing was pulling them closer. But Lyson, distance strips away performance. It removes urgency. It leaves only what survives without constant attention. That idea shaped almost everything about the way I lived. I learned early that not every connection deserved to become permanent, and not every conversation deserved to continue once the moment that created it disappeared. People came and went, carrying pieces of themselves they believed were unforgettable, but time had a habit of proving otherwise. What once felt significant slowly dissolved into memory, and memory eventually became silence. I accepted that. More than that, I depended on it, because if everything eventually faded, then there was no reason to allow anything to reach the deepest parts of me. It was a practical way to exist, measured, balanced, predictable. Nothing entered unless I chose to open the door. Nothing remained unless I decided it belonged there. At least, that's what I believed. Then something happened that didn't follow any pattern I had spent years learning. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't there wasn't a moment where everything suddenly became different. No unforgettable conversation, no life-changing event. No perfect sentence that echoed through my mind. If someone asked me where it started, I wouldn't be able to answer, honestly, because the beginning wasn't visible. It happened beneath awareness, quietly enough that I only noticed it after it had already become part of me. That's the unsettling thing about real change. It rarely announces itself. It simply rearranges the room while you're still convinced everything is exactly where you left it. I I remember trying to understand why your presence felt familiar, not comforting, not exciting, familiar. Those are different things. Comfort can be created. Excitement fades. But familiarity. Familiarity exists before explanation. It appears without asking permission from logic. You don't decide something feels familiar. You discover that it already does. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I questioned it constantly. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe I had simply become too observant. Maybe I was finding meaning where none actually existed. That seemed more reasonable. After all, the mind enjoys creating patterns. It connects unrelated moments. It fills empty spaces. It searches for order inside randomness because uncertainty has always been difficult to carry. The- So I convinced myself that all this was a coincidence stretched into something larger by attention. Nothing more. Except coincidences don't become more precise over time. They become weaker, less convincing. This did the opposite. Every interaction added another layer that shouldn't have existed. Every silence carried information words failed to express. Every conversation felt strangely unfinished, felt something was missing, not because something was missing, but because it seemed to continue long after speaking. Stopped. I had never experienced that before. Usually conversations end when people stop talking. With you, they seem to continue somewhere beyond language. I would leave thinking everything had already been said. Hours later, I would realize I was still responding internally to things neither of us had spoken aloud. It was as if understanding had found another way to move between us, not through explanation, not through emotion, but through attention. And attention is dangerous. People often mistake attention for interest. They are not the same. Interest asks questions. Attention notices. Answers before questions are necessary. Most people listen because they're waiting for their turn to speak. Very few listen simply to understand what already exists. You did, not loudly, not obviously, almost invisibly. You noticed the details everyone else ignored. The hesitation before a sentence, the slight shift in tone when certainty disappeared, the difference between silence that needed space and silence that needed company. Those distinctions are almost impossible to explain. Most people never recognize them. You seem to recognize them instinctively. That made me uncomfortable. Not because you were doing anything wrong, because you were seeing things I hadn't intended to reveal, and somehow, I couldn't tell you how, I never felt exposed. I felt observed accurately. There's a difference. Exposure feels invasive. Oxycracy feels unavoidable. One makes you want to hide. The other makes hiding seem unnecessary. That was unfamiliar territory. I've always believed that people understand only the version of you they're capable of seeing, but not because they're incapable of caring, but because everyone interprets reality through themselves. They don't see you exactly as you are. They see where you overlap with their own experiences. Everything else becomes assumption. That's human nature. No one escapes it completely. At least, I thought no one did. Then I started noticing something unusual. You rarely assumed. When something wasn't clear, you didn't rush to define it. You allowed uncertainty to exist. That alone separated you from almost everyone I had ever known. People fear uncertainty. They label it quickly be- because labels create comfort. Even inaccurate certainty feels safer than honest confusion. You never seemed ins- interested in false certainty. If something needed time, you gave it time. If something remained undefined, you let it remain undefined. That kind of patience isn't passive, it's disciplined. It comes from someone who understands that truth doesn't become clearer by forcing it. Sometimes it becomes clearer only after you've stopped trying to control it. I don't know when I began respecting that. I only know that one day I realized I had stopped preparing myself before speaking. That habit had followed me for years. Every sentence passed through invisible filters. Should I explain this differently? Should I leave this part out? Will this be misunderstood? Do I need to make this easier to hear? Those questions had become automatic. They disappeared around you. Not completely, but enough for me to notice. That's when I became suspicious of myself. People don't change lifelong habits overnight. Something must have caused it. So I paid closer attention, not to you, to me. I wanted to understand why my own mind was behaving differently, why it felt less defensive, why conversations required less effort, why silence no longer felt like something that needed to be managed. The more I observed, the stranger it became. Nothing external had changed. My routines were the same. My life was the same. The world around me remained exactly as it had been. The only difference was the space your presence occupied inside my awareness, not physically, mentally. It's difficult to explain that distinction without sounding dramatic. I'm not talking about constantly thinking about someone. That's ordinary. This wasn't. You weren't interrupting my thoughts. You had somehow become part of the way they formed. That's much harder to recognize. You only notice it when something reminds you that your internal landscape isn't arranged the way it used to be. Imagine walking through your own house. You've lived there for years. You know exactly where every wall stands, every doorway, every piece of furniture. Then, one night, someone quietly moves a single chair. Nothing else changes. The house remains yours. Yet suddenly your memory no longer matches reality. You hesitate, not because you've forgotten your home, because something inside it has shifted without your permission. That's what this felt like. Everything was still mine. My thoughts, my perspective, my choices. Yet something fundamental had changed position, and every path my mind followed eventually passed by it. That realization should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it made me curious. This curiosity isn't something I usually allow to linger. Questions demand answers. If I don't understand something, I investigate until I do. That's always been my process. This time, the answers refused to arrive in the order I expected. Every explanation created another question. Every conclusion dissolved into another observation. It wasn't frustrating. It was strangely peaceful, as though the experience itself mattered more than solving it. That alone was unlike me. I don't enjoy uncertainty. I tolerate it only until clarity appears. Yet, here I was, allowing something undefined to continue existing without rushing it, without controlling it, without demanding it become something easier to understand. I started wondering if clarity had been misunderstood all along. Maybe clarity isn't always knowing exactly what something is. Maybe sometimes clarity is recognizing that something is real before you can explain why. That thought stayed with me long after I expected it to disappear because it challenged something I had believed for years. I always thought understanding came first, recognition second. Now it seemed possible that recognition arrived long before explanation ever caught up. Maybe that's why certain people feel significant before they've done anything significant. Significant. Maybe that's why some conversations remain with you, while entire years disappear without leaving anything behind. Vivant. Maybe meaning isn't created by time. May Maybe time simply reveals what already carried meaning from the beginning. If that's true, then everything I believed about connection changes, because I always measured relationships by duration. How long someone stayed, how much history existed, how many experiences were shared. Those things felt objective, reliable. Now I wasn't so sure because somehow, without any of those measurements, something had reached a level I couldn't explain through time alone. That that possibility forced me to confront another question, one I had avoided without realizing it. What if depth isn't earned? What if sometimes it's simply recognized? That idea unsettled me more than anything else. Because if depth can exist without permission, then control becomes an illusion. And I've spent years believing control was the foundation of stability. Maybe it isn't. Maybe stability comes from something quieter, something that doesn't depend on walls, or distance, or carefully measured access. Maybe it comes from recognizing the rare moments when nothing needs to be forced. When understanding exists before explanation. When presence says more than effort ever could. I don't know if that's what this is. I only know that every attempt to reduce it into something ordinary has quietly failed. Not dramatically, not dramatically, not all at once. One assumption at a time, one certainty at a time, until all that remained was something I could no longer dismiss, something that asked for nothing, demanded nothing, promised nothing, yet somehow continued to exist with a consistency I couldn't explain away. And for the first time in a very long time, I stopped trying to make sense of everything immediately. I simply watched. Not because I had given up on understanding, but because understanding, for once, seemed patient enough to arrive on its own. I used to believe that every meaningful change announced itself, a decision, a confession, a goodbye, something visible enough that you could point to it later and say, that was the moment everything became different. Life rarely works that way. Most transformations begin quietly enough to be mistaken for ordinary days. You wake up believing you're still the same person, only to discover weeks later that your thoughts no longer travel the roads they once knew. Certain ideas no longer satisfy you. Certain conversations feel smaller than they used to. The things that once demanded your attention slowly lose their gravity, replaced by questions you never expected to ask. That's how this unfolded. Not through a single unforgettable moment, but through countless ordinary ones, through countless ordinary that gradually refused to remain ordinary. I noticed it while walking alone. I noticed it during conversations with people who had known me for years. I noticed it in the strange feeling that my mind was no longer searching for the same things it had always searched for. It wasn't that I had changed direction. It was that my definition of direction had changed. For years, I believed certainty came from collecting answers. Now I wasn't so sure. Uh, Maybe certainty comes from learning which questions deserve to remain open. There's an unusual kind of strength in resisting the urge to explain everything immediately. Most people don't realize how exhausting constant explanation becomes. Every emotion translated, every thought justified, every silence interpreted. Eventually, you begin speaking less, not because you have nothing to say, but because language starts feeling too small for what you're trying to protect. I reached that point a long time ago. Silence became less of an absence and more of a place where unfinished thoughts could breathe without being forced into conclusions they weren't ready for. Most people treated that silence like a problem. They hurried through it, filled it with opinions, turned uncertainty into confidence simply because confidence sounded better. I understood why. Silence makes people confront themselves. Not everyone enjoys that experience, but I never feared silence. I feared careless interpretation. There's a difference. Silence leaves room for truth. Careless interpretations, truth replaces with convenience. Maybe that's why I became so careful with what I revealed. Not because I distrusted people, because I understood how easily something genuine could become distorted once it passed through expectations, assumptions, and personal narratives. Everyone believes they're listening objectively. Very few actually are. We're all translating each other through lives no one else has lived. The remarkable thing isn't that misunderstandings happen. The remarkable thing is that understanding happens at all. Perhaps that's why genuine recognition feels so rare. Not impossible. Just uncommon enough that when it appears, you hesitate before believing it. You wonder whether you're imagining it, whether you're simply seeing what you hope to find. I asked myself those questions more times than I can count. Each time I reached the same conclusion. Hope creates fantasy. Creates fantasy. Fantasy eventually collapses. Reality survives examination. And the more honestly I examined this quiet shift inside myself, the less it resembled imagination. It wasn't becoming larger because I wanted it to. It was becoming clearer because I stopped resisting what I was already noticing. There's an important difference between inventing meaning and discovering it. One requires effort, the other requires honesty. Honesty has a strange way of dismantling the stories we tell ourselves. There's, it removes the dramatic versions first, then the comforting ones. Eventually, all that's left is something surprisingly simple. Sometimes simplicity is the most difficult truth to accept. Not because it's complicated, because we as we expect important things to to arrive wrapped in complexity. Maybe they don't. Maybe the deepest changes begin with something as ordinary as paying attention. Not attention driven by obsession, not attention driven by need, just quiet awareness, the kind that asks for nothing except honesty. I've begun to think awareness changes us long before action ever does. Every decision starts as perception. Every new direction begins as a different way of seeing. Uh, Perhaps that's why my world feels subtly unfamiliar now. The world itself hasn't changed. I have, not completely, not dramatically, just enough that I can't return to the exact perspective I carried before. The status is, it's a strange realization. It's a strange realization. Um, you spend years believing identity is built through major events, only to discover it changes through invisible moments no one else would ever notice. Fixate, a single conversation, a thoughtful pause, a silence that somehow says more than certainty ever could. Those moments don't ask permission to stay. They simply do. And once they become part of you, they quietly reshape everything that follows. Oh, I don't know exactly where this path leads. For the first time, that uncertainty doesn't feel like failure. It feels like proof that some truths deserve to arrive at their own pace. Maybe wisdom isn't reaching the destination first. Maybe it's becoming someone capable of recognizing it when it finally appears. There comes a moment when you stop asking whether something belongs in your life and begin asking why you resisted it for so long. Not because the answer changes the past, because it changes the way you see yourself. I used to think every choice I made was deliberate. Every boundary was carefully designed, every distance intentionally maintained. It gave me confidence to believe that nothing entered my world without my permission. Looking back, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Some of the most important influences in our lives don't arrive through decisions. They arrive through repetition, a conversation here, a shared silence there, a perspective that quietly returns until it becomes impossible to remember how you thought before encountering it. That's how real transformation often works. It doesn't replace who you are. Who you are, if I was, it reveals what was unfinished. For a long time, I confused strength with self-sufficiency. I believed needing no one was evidence of maturity. Depending only on my own judgment felt safe because safety rarely prizes you. But safety has limits. It protects you from disappointment, yet it also protects you from discovery. Nothing unfamiliar can enter a life that's completely sealed. Nothing unexpected can teach someone determined to remain unchanged. I don't regret the walls I built. They served, I built this, they served their purpose. They gave me space to understand my own mind without constant interruption. But walls are meant to protect a home, not become the home, become the home itself. There is a difference between living behind boundaries and becoming them. I never noticed when that line disappeared. Perhaps that's why this experience feels less like meeting something new and more like remembering something forgotten. Not a memory, a capacity. The capacity to let reality surprise me again. To admit that certainty isn't always the highest form of wisdom. Sometimes humility sees further than confidence. Humility allows you to say, but I don't fully understand this yet, but I know it deserves my attention. Those words once sounded uncertain to me. Now they sound honest. Honesty has become far more valuable than certainty. Certainty often ends conversations. Certainty. Honesty begins them. The older I become, the less interested I am in people who always have answers. I'm drawn instead to those who ask better questions. Questions that don't exist to impress anyone. Mm. Questions that quietly uncover truth. I've realized that truth rarely competes for attention. It waits bidently until someone becomes still enough to notice it. Stillness is misunderstood. Many assume it means doing nothing. I think it means observing without immediately judging, listening without preparing a reply, existing without constantly trying to reshape every experience into something familiar. That kind of stillness has changed me more than any dramatic event ever has. It taught me that growth isn't always visible while it's happening. Sometimes you recognize it only when an old fear no longer controls your decisions, or when a conversation that once would have exhausted you now feels effortless, or when silence stops feeling empty and begins feeling complete. These are quiet victories. The world rarely celebrates them, yet they often matter more than the milestones everyone notices. I've stopped measuring progress by how much I've achieved. Instead, I measure it by how differently I respond to the same situation. A calmer reaction, a slower judgment, a willingness to understand. before deciding. Those changes don't make headlines. They change lives anyway. Maybe that's the purpose of every meaningful encounter. Uh, Not to become the center of your story, but to reveal a chapter you didn't know was waiting to be written. Some people arrive carrying solutions. Others arrive carrying mirrors. The second group is rarer. They don't tell you who to become. They quietly remind you of the parts of yourself you have overlooked. That reminder is rarely comfortable. Growth almost never is. It asks you to release identities that once protected you, to outgrow explanations that once felt complete, to admit that yesterday's certainty may not survive tomorrow's understanding. There is freedom in that admission, because once you stop defending an outdated version of yourself, you create room for a more honest one to emerge. I don't know exactly who I'll become from here. For once, that uncertainty doesn't feel like losing direction. It feels like finally allowing life to teach me something I couldn't have learned alone. Maybe that's enough. Maybe, maybe not every journey needs a perfect conclusion. Maybe some are meant to leave us with a quieter gift. The ability to meet tomorrow with less fear than we carried yesterday. And perhaps that's the clearest sign that something truly meaningful has happened. Not that the world around us looks different, but that we do.